Greetings sailors, and welcome to a little look at the upcoming Nueve de Julio, which we now have had confirmed is in its more or less final state, including, unfortunately, the name. And that's the thing I want to talk about in this video, is Wargaming's peculiar decision, at least in my eyes, to stick with this being the Nueve de Julio, because that boat has a rather unfortunate history. Now, this initially started out, both in-game and in real life, as the USS Boise, a Brooklyn-class light cruiser, which is almost the counterpart of the regular Tier 7 light cruiser on the American line, the Helena, which is one of the two St. Louis-class cruisers. Now, you can see why they called it the Helena instead of the St. Louis class, but basically the St. Louis class was an updated or slightly betterized version, that's definitely the right word to use there, version of the Brooklyn class cruisers. So all in all, with the Helena and St. Louis on top of the 7 Brooklyn class ships, you have 9 in total. 6 of them post-war ended up with various South American navies: the Argentinian Navy, the Brazilian Navy, and the Chilean Navy. Now, why I'm bringing this up is that of all those ships, it's the 2 that went to the Argentinian Navy that are not contentious in their history, but they are contentious in if you wanted to add them to World of Warships. The other 4 ships are completely fine, and they could have chosen any of those 4 ships to represent this first South American ship in the game, as a, one of the either the St. Louis or Brooklyn class cruiser. But instead, no, they chose one of the problematic ones. Now, of the 2 that went to Argentina, one was the former USS Phoenix, which eventually ended up becoming called the General Belgrano, and I probably don't need to tell you why that would be a somewhat controversial choice. The other was the USS Boise, which became the Nueve de Julio. And well, in their careers, the Belgrano was sunk in wartime, and it's not the only ship in-game that we've had that was sunk in wartime, but it would be controversial for other reasons. The Nueve de Julio, on the other hand, didn't have that eventful of a career overall. In 1955, it took part in the revolution of that year, and I believe later that year, or was it the next year, it ended up ramming into the General Belgrano. And that was pretty much it until the 70s. Now, it was actually decommissioned in 1971 and tied up at the Puerto Belgrano naval base. And basically it was left to sit there and rot for a good couple of years. The problematic part of the history of this ship comes from 1976. And basically, as part of the so-called Dirty War, which is really not a very nice part of Argentina's history and just a fairly horrible thing to read about overall, it was used as basically a secret detention facility. And detention facilities, putting it nicely, basically people disappeared into this facility and they were held on board this ship and they just never came out again. And, they were tortured and raped and murdered, and the whole thing was just completely horrible. And this was happening basically all over Argentina. And so why Wargaming should have chosen this ship, given its unfortunate connotations, especially if you are an Argentinian player, it really does baffle me, because we have all these other choices. We could have had the former USS Brooklyn itself, which became the O'Higgins. There's the Chacabuco, which was the Nashville. There is the Barroso, which ended up with the Brazilian Navy, as did the former St. Louis as the Tamandare. So why not choose one of those? Why not choose one of those ships that doesn't have the connotations of being a torture boat? I don't know. it just seems like a really odd thing for Wargaming to have done. And I actually went hunting on the official forums for this. There was a thread. Somebody inevitably did bring this up, because it's not like it's hard to find this bit of this ship's history. And there really wasn't an official response from Wargaming up until the point where the thread itself was closed, because it had pretty badly derailed at that point. And as near as I can tell from that response, which was basically the ship had a long and distinguished career, well, yes, as the Boise, but they're not selling it as the Boise, which is kind of missing the point of why somebody had started the thread in the first place, and that they're fine with selling it as it is, with those connotations. And I don't get it. And I've been trying to come up with some suitable analogy, and the closest I can do so really is, if they want to sell it as this ship, then to my mind it's not a million miles away from in World of Tanks selling a premium Tiger, let's say, and we do have a couple of premium Tigers in World of Tanks, but selling a premium Tiger such as Tiger 131, but selling it with an SS Panzer Division skin. It's the same machine, but it has very different connotations. And it's so ludicrously easy to avoid those connotations. You just pick one of the other ships. You just call it something different. And maybe it needs a little bit of remodeling to go along with that, but that's fine. It could basically be the same boat without the horrible connotations of the Dirty War. But no, Wargaming has chosen this hill to die on, so I don't know. I don't imagine the reception from Argentinian players is going to be particularly good. I don't imagine the reception from many players who know about the history is going to be good, but I know there are probably going to be a bunch of people that just don't care. And there certainly were people in that forum thread who were, weirdly enough, trying to draw equivalency between the Dirty War and various other wartime actions, between, you know, actual armed forces. It's kind of not the same thing. So as near as I can figure, and this is just pure speculation, the only reason we have this at all is because Wargaming started off wanting to put the Boise into the game, and perhaps because we already have 3 Tier 7 premium American cruisers already, they then decided, well, why don't we start it off as being an entire new nation, essentially, or, well, group of nations as it's representing in this case. And okay, I can see that. I can see wanting to have the Boise in the game as the Boise, but it kind of falls down when we get to why they want it in as the Nueve de Julio. It just does seem to be, I don't know, a lack of care on Wargaming's part about the history of this ship. Because I really can't see any other reason why they would have kept the name as the Nueve de Julio. If you want the Boise in the game, have the Boise in the game as the Boise. I don't think anybody would have any issues with that. Why they had to choose this particular ship, I don't know. And just looking at the very little reasoning Wargaming has given when I asked in the Discord about it, it would almost make more sense for them to have chosen the Belgrano by their own logic. But personally, I think it would be better if we just avoided both ships, because, you know, it might seem like we're drawing some arbitrary lines here, but as with the example I gave from World of Tanks, sometimes we do draw arbitrary lines. And sometimes you have to draw a line somewhere. In this case, I think drawing the line at the point before you add the torture boat to the game would probably have been a good thing. But anyway, here we are. So, on to the ship itself, on how it performs in-game. What you see here is not quite the version that will be released. Most of the stats are fixed, but they did say they're changing one thing. What you're seeing is the Nueve de Julio with 810 meters turning radius. Yeah, it's not so nice with that. but they are trimming that down to, I think, 710. It's around 100 meters less. That still puts it over what the Helena has, but otherwise the main differences in characteristics are pretty much around the firepower and the fact that this has a heal. Now, in terms of the firepower, it's the same 15 barrels and the same turret arrangement that you find on the Helena. But what you get in addition to that is a shorter range, and the Helena's already got a fairly short range. This is even shorter still by a full kilometre. It's 13.6. In fact, it's very slightly under 13.6, but the game rounds it off to 13.6 when you look at it in port, which makes it only about 500 metres better than what you can manage with the Atlanta, of course. So this thing is pretty short-ranged. To go along with that, it still has the same surface concealment as the Helena. So unlike the Atlanta, which is naturally fairly stealthy, this thing isn't, which is a bit of an awkward combination. If there was one thing I would really like to see on this ship, other than a different name, it is a little bit more range, even if it's only another 500 meters or so. It does, in addition to all that, have better turret traverse, so it's more responsive than the Helena, but a slower rate of fire. I would actually quite like to see that difference implemented between the Eugen and the Hipper, because this isn't the only example we have of two ships of a very similar class being in the game. As it stands at the moment, the Hipper got a bunch of buffs and the Eugen got a heal. I would have liked the Eugen to get the same buffs that the Hipper got, but if you had to pay the penalty of having a lower range, then I think I could have lived with that. But as it is, the Eugen is basically the pre-buff Hipper, only with a heal. In this case, there's a bit more difference going on between this ship and the Helena, and the heal in particular does actually make quite a big difference for its tier. Now, if you saw my video on the light cruisers generally, you'll know I'm not hugely fond of the playstyle, which is basically sit behind an island and wait for them to come to you. The heal makes it so that that doesn't always need to be the case. You saw me in the very early stages of this game try to get into a position to do that. And as it turned out, it didn't really work out. We dealt with the forces that were there. On that side, there were a couple that ran away, and fortunately for me, most of the team, instead of charging off after them, actually turned around to deal with the ships that were pressing in from the other side, which is unfortunately what tends to happen on this particular map. So this was a rare instance of the team actually working together and responding cohesively to what the enemy team was doing. So now I'm doing what I absolutely would not want to do in any of the other light US cruisers, which is fight over open water. And it's basically the heal that's giving me the capability to do that. But the thing really to note here as well is that I am trying to do so as part of a group of friendly ships. I'm trying not to isolate myself excessively, although I am maybe a little bit too far forward at this point. Not that you can really get too far away from the enemy, because of course you've got a really short range to work with. There is always that limiting factor. It is definitely going to be a less awkward experience with the better turn radius, though. That was one of the things I really didn't like about this when it was being tested. I'm glad to see that they did change it. But as with the Eugen, you know, the effect of the heal is basically it's going to keep you in the fight for longer. And I would say with this many barrels, and certainly with an IFHE captain, which is an absolute necessity, it becomes quite a potent damage dealer. Maybe even more so than the Eugen for its tier. In fact, definitely more so than the Eugen for its tier. Because you've got a 10-second reload, which is still reasonably fast. You've got a lot of guns, and you have massively a benefit from IFHE. So it all stacks up to make basically a shotgun of a ship. Short-ranged, but with a really high damage output, potentially. And so, even though I started off not hugely enjoying this when I was first playing it, it's grown on me. It actually has kind of grown on me as a ship to play. And it purely is because of that heel. You know, the other characteristics make a difference. The improved turret rotation definitely makes a difference. It's only a couple of seconds longer on the Helena. I think it's, what, 22.5 versus 18. But still, when you're in a light cruiser that's dancing around in the open, every bit of turret traverse that you can get is going to help you immeasurably, especially with that slightly awkward forward turret arrangement. And the fact that you can do this is just so much more interesting as a playstyle, that you have this option compared to the rest of the light cruiser line for the Americans. And really the only downside of this ship as it is, the only major downside apart from that really close range, which is, you know, if I'd been focused down really hard by this enemy team, I would be dead right now. It's only the fact that I'm with a group of friendly ships and that the enemy team has been splitting their fire and not all exclusively trying to fire at me. And I think that Colorado was firing HE as well, which also really, really helps. Yeah, you wouldn't want to try this in any of the other light cruisers. And I don't particularly like those ships, because they just are so one-dimensional. This has options. I like ships that have options. You can sit behind an island, you can play it that way, or you can dance around in the open, you can take that slight risk, but you can also, as you're doing it, pump out so much damage. And initially when this dropped in our laps, I was of the mind that, oh, you know, the range is barely better than the Atlanta, why would you play this over the Atlanta? But it didn't have that heel as the Boise. Now it has that heel, that makes all the difference. And so, although it's still rather fragile, although dancing around in front of battleships like that is an inherently risky business in a cruiser, that heel is enough. It's enough to make a really big difference. So it transpired that there was that one enemy ship left. They'd gone AFK, and we had this little traffic jam in the middle here, and you might have noted earlier on when I was trying to withdraw and I stopped firing, and yet I was still spotted. I figured there was a destroyer still around on that flank, but as it turned out they were already AFK at that point. That is definitely a disadvantage of this. You know, the IFH is a must, but I would say Concealment Expert is also a must, because when your range is so short, to have your base concealment be really not that far off your maximum firing range, that's a real penalty in a cruiser. That's a really hefty price to pay even. And if it didn't make up for it by having such a potential as a damage dealer, then I would say this was not worth getting. But as it is, for me, the main strikes against it at the moment are the fact that they called it the Nueve de Julio, and the fact that when you buy this thing, you're going to have to start grinding a whole new captain for it, or else dump a whole bunch of elite captain XP into it. So, I was definitely not displeased with that damage output. The team played relatively well in that one. I've had obviously far worse games in it, but if you get a team that isn't completely horrible, it's like any cruiser. If your team gives you some space to work with, then you can do all right. And if you get the opportunity to use that tremendous damage output, then you can get some really nice results from it. Certainly more so than a lot of other premium cruisers. You compare this to the Indianapolis. This is a far more consistent experience. So yeah, it really has grown on me as a ship to play. But I wouldn't buy one, and basically it's because of that name. I just think the whole thing is massively insensitive on Wargaming's part. And while I know they absolutely would never in a million years add an SS Panzer Division skin to World of Tanks, by that same token, I don't understand why they would do something so questionable in World of Warships. But here we are. Hopefully Wargaming will come to their senses. I guess it just depends on how much public feedback they get about it. Maybe they're just counting on not enough people knowing. Maybe they're just counting on ignorance and selling the torture boats through people not knowing the connotations of what they're getting. I don't know. Anyway, I really do hope they come to their senses though, because it's otherwise an interestingly refreshing ship to play compared to the rest of the US light cruisers. It maybe tells us something what the US light cruisers would be like if they had a heel. They wouldn't be quite so one-dimensional then. So that's it for this video. I would genuinely be interested to hear from any Argentinian viewers what they think in the comments down below, and I'm sure there'll be one or two other comments as well. You can of course do all the other usual things as well, and as always, stay tuned for more.